Great. So I'll just hope to see all the other panelists logging on. In the meantime, I will kick us off. Welcome, everyone. I'm Simon Mundy, the Moral Money editor at the Financial Times. Very pleased to be with you all today. Now, this is an area that I've been interested in for a long time with increasing intensity, the role of the law and regulation in tackling the issues that we have both on an environmental front, on a social front. I think we see more and more initiatives from the private sector, companies seeking to seize the initiative and show that they are seeking to have a positive impact and tackle any negative impacts they may be having. And I think we can all agree that's a good thing in and of itself. I think where things get more complicated is when there's a sense that these private sector-led initiatives might be distracting from certain things that could be needed in terms of new laws and regulations. And also something that I know one of our panelists is keen to talk about, the potential for some companies to be talking a great game on positive environmental and social impacts, while perhaps much more quietly, not with their advertising departments and marketing departments, but through their lobbying departments, actually taking actions that could hinder progress on those fronts. So this is the one of the key things that we're going to be talking about, and we'll have much more to discuss with the panel here today. We've got a great mix of panelists whom I will just introduce briefly. We have Nate St. Victor, who's the General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer at Engine Number One, which I'm sure everyone has now heard of in quite some detail following its very high-profile campaign to place new directors on the board of Exxon. Alberto Alemano, who is the Jean Monnet Professor of European Union Law at HEC Paris and the founder of The Good Lobby, which is a non-profit that is committed to equalizing access to power by making corporate lobbying more responsible. Gillian Marcel, who's the CEO of Resilience Capital Ventures. Gillian and I have been in touch many times in the past since I took over the job at Moral Money. And Dr. Marcel has developed the Triple B framework, which I'll be asking her more about later. She can fill us in on how that can help us to look at some of these issues. And last but certainly not least, Julia Black, who is Professor of Law at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where she focuses on the legitimacy and dynamics of regulatory regimes. So a really good selection of perspectives here. Nate, just to start with you, I think we'll need to come on in more detail to the Exxon campaign, which I'm sure everyone will be keen to hear more detail about. But first of all, just to kick us off, from a broad point of view, where do you think we stand in terms of the legal and regulatory status quo within which lawyers such as yourself operate? And what sort of improvements do you think could be called for and could be possible? I think you're on mute, Nate.
Most often heard phrase during COVID. You're on mute.
Indeed.
And it's always so kind because often people know that you are on mute, but they'll just say, I think. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Happy to be here. It's quite a pleasure. Look, this is formative, right? The launch week of GAIL. So I'd be remiss not to take a moment to just thank you, GAIL, the founders, the cohorts that have created this new opportunity to come together and share insights, bring our authenticity and our relationships to bear in order to affect change. As was offered in the opening remarks, we need catalysts. And that's what this is, right? And there's never been, in my opinion, a more exciting time to be practicing law. There's never been a greater opportunity to be a change agent. And quite frankly, Simon, what I'll tell you is coming to Engine Number One last May has been deeply fulfilling for me on many fronts, but selfishly, one, front is I've had this casual competition with my wife, who's a medical practitioner, and over 2 decades of practicing law, she always had the one up on me in terms of she saves lives, right? So her job is more important than mine. And coming over to Engine Number One with our purpose-built mission to affect change gave me the pleasure to be able to finally say, well, dear, I'm actually trying to save the world. So it's great. It's great to be able to be a part of this mission, and it's great to have cohorts like GAIL. So that said, to your point about the status quo, I would say there is no status quo. Somebody referenced Matrix earlier. There is no spoon. There is no status quo in the legal framework. The regulators, our industry leaders, lawyers across the world are exploring this imperative to change the economic system. And we are all evaluating what our role as impact lawyers and what our businesses' roles are in order to be a part of that change. And again, it's very inspirational. And when I look across the legal framework, and I'll let some of my colleagues internationally speak about other frameworks, but when I think about at least the US framework, it is ever changing. And when I think about our primary regulators, with Engine Number One being an impact investment firm regulated by the SEC, and when I think about our purpose-built mission and how we work with companies as active owners, and I think about how issuers are being impacted, and I think about the Department of Labor's the rules creating challenges for ESG investing, and how we now have proposed rules intended to smooth these challenges, I think about progress, and I think about one word: transparency. Okay, and I think it all starts at transparency, and we're waiting with bated breath at Engine Number One to digest, evaluate, and react to the forthcoming climate risk rules that will be coming out of the SEC. We think that it's necessary that this focus on climate risk and carbon sensitivities to dig into the concepts of Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, and some of us Scope 4 emissions, and evaluate how can that information about the companies and their actions be provided to investors so that we're making thoughtful decisions that align with our values. So we're encouraged that the climate disclosures will be coming from the SEC. We're also encouraged that the human capital management proposal will come as well.
Thanks so much, Nate. Some great points there. Gillian, coming to you, and I know that you've got a lot of focus on, from a global perspective, not only in the US and Europe, but also the situation in developing countries, including in the Caribbean and elsewhere. So how do you think it looks from that point of view? How would you assess the progress that's being made at the global level, and also more specifically in some of the countries that you've been focused on? And what do you think are the key things that we need to improve at the broad level?
Hi, thanks so much for that question, Simon. And like Nate, I would also want to thank the organizers for including me in this really important panel. To answer that question, and first of all, I think the Triple B framework applies to the global architecture as much as it does to developing countries. So let me answer in this way. I believe that the work that GAIL is doing has to start with an understanding of what are the challenges we are in fact facing. And I usually begin by reminding people of the obscene levels of inequality that we're facing as a result of late stage capital being the dominant logic. Because I think it's important for us to understand that whatever we're doing has to address the fact that the world's richest 1% has twice as much financial wealth as 6.9 billion people. So let that sink in. Also, we've seen the differential impact of the pandemic, not only on countries, but within countries on particular groups. We've seen that the pandemic has had an incredibly different effect on women and marginalized communities, even in wealthy countries. And we've seen that the willingness to accept cause really is different across many different kinds of countries. For climate change and for other things, such as the root causes of inequality. So acknowledgement of past harms must be part of what we are attempting to do in addressing the impact finance and the impact agenda. And so when it comes to what can we do, I think that there are three principles that I would include. And some of them are at an operational level, but I think the most important principles are actually in the area of cognitive justice. If we are attempting to fix, even to diagnose what are the causes of the problems that we face, without being genuine about who gets to be seen as a solutions architect, who gets to be seen as a global thought leader, we will not come up with the right answers. And so cognitive justice, a real belief in equity, and then finally, there are some specific sort of technical interventions that I'm happy to speak about when we next come back to speak about the ways in which we actually have to think differently about blended finance, reimagine what we have understood to be the technical innovations within impact finance, if we are to actually mobilize finance and other forms of capital to address some of these key issues. And of course, with war in Europe, it means the disruption and risk management and addressing peace and sustainability will become even higher up on our agenda. So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much, Gillian. That's a really wonderful overview. Alberto, coming to you, I don't know if there are specific points that Nate and Gillian mentioned there that you might want to pick up on, expand on, take issue with, perhaps. But generally, from your point of view, I'm interested in, at the outset, getting each panelist's sense of what we need to focus on in terms of this regulatory endgame that is the subject of this conversation. What do you think should be the focus for regulators, for lawmakers, and for society as a whole?
Thank you, Simon. Hello, everybody. Apologies for being late in our conversation today. Let me highlight the fact that most of my research at the moment is focusing on something quite specific and narrow, but very often overlooked, which is the role of the private sector in the way in which the sustainability initiatives are emerging. And in particular, the notion of corporate political accountability. That means the extent to which companies today are consistent in the way in which they commit to take major sustainability commitments, while at the same time pushing back these very same sustainability reforms. This is what we often refer as decoupling, companies that commit towards a major sustainability improvement along their supply chain, while at the same time lobbying hard against those very strict standards from applying to them. We have witnessed over the last 2 or 3 years a pretty manifest situation of inconsistencies, companies that are basically saying, we want to be green, we are pushing for the Green New Deal on the two sides of the Atlantic, while being members of trade associations that are actively lobbying against those sustainability packages from actually being implemented. This is something that just happened across Europe, as you might have seen with the sustainable corporate governance being watered down as a result of, on the one hand, the US Chamber of Commerce, Business Europe on the other hand. In other words, there is a major emergency here, which is to basically highlight the need for companies not only to internalize their environmental and social footprint, but also what I call the democracy footprint. In other words, how we can make sure that the corporate political power, which is exercised every single day by our companies, is consistent to the major statements, the corporate governance of those very same companies. And unfortunately, as of today, we don't have one single mechanism that allow this exercise of corporate political activities, from lobbying all the way to membership to trade associations, all the way to academic chairs or think tank support, that clearly show to investors, to customers, to employees, what these companies actually do stand for. There's a lack of accountability of the exercise of corporate political power. And unfortunately, the legal profession, as it is often the case, is willingly or not somehow playing an enabler role. So we are enabling, as a legal profession, the fact that many of those companies are actually playing a bit of a double game. Sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes, most of the time, it's not even deliberate. There's not even aware within a big company what the department is actually doing with the left hand. Might be, let's say, the marketing, the ESG related department, and then their corporate affairs, their lobbying right hand. So this kind of disconnect, I think, is becoming more and more, I would say, visible. Some ESG scores are trying to capture this, but still we lack a mechanism enabling, again, investors, customers, employees to actually get a sense of what is happening around here.
Thank you so much, Alberto. Julia, coming to you to round off these opening remarks. What's your sense? And again, I don't know if there are points that Alberto, Julian, and Nate made that you wanted to expand on. But where do you think the focus needs to be? Because there's a lot happening at the moment in terms of regulatory changes. There's not as much as there needs to be. Where do you think the focus needs to be?
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. And hello to everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to come along today. So I think really interesting, needless to say, really interesting set of issues. And I think I want to build on what Alberto was saying there in relation to corporate accountability and look at the attempts that are being made to incentivize or to pressure firms themselves to change their modes of behavior, but through the financial system. So, and listen, so greening the financial system has two elements to it. It's getting the firms who provide capital, both credit and equity, to themselves change their own motivations and capacities so that they direct capital in a pro-climate way, either to look at the causes of climate change or its consequences, focusing on climate adaptation and mitigation. But there's a really complex theory of change in place here, right? So you've got a whole pile of quite heroic assumptions in play for how this might work. So you've got to orientate a bunch of firms who are, profit maximizing. This is absolutely their core orientation in the financial space. And you've got to persuade them that it's actually in their interest to reallocate capital in a way that they haven't reallocated it before. Second, next, what you've got to be able to do, you've got to assume is that the firms themselves who are seeking that capital are going to change their own behavior in response to the cost of capital or access to the capital they may or may not have, depending on their own pro-climate behavior. Now, for all of those things to happen, both sets of firms have to have the motivation to do this, but they also have to have the capacity. And one of the where the whole regulatory system comes into play, in a way, is partly to force such firms, but very much what it is at the moment is provide the capacity, provide that legal, accounting and data infrastructure, so that if firms do have the motivation to actually change their behaviors in this way, then what they need underpinning that is the data to enable them to do that, but they also need a legal infrastructure. And that's where I think the role of lawyers can come in and can be very positive. But what we are also seeing is an incredibly complex system, as you say, Simon, emerging of multiple regulators, multiple different bodies. And I think it's really interesting to see how these dynamics will play out. But just final point, I think it's really interesting and just important to note as well that these dynamics on greening the financial system will work for accountable capital which itself is accountable to other investors, to corporate response, to corporate reporting, etc. And it will work on those firms who are also accountable in that way. But we know that we have a whole pile of unaccountable capital going to unaccountable firms. And one of the risks, the kind of paradoxes, as it were, in the regulatory press for greening the financial system is actually move more and more of that capital into unaccountable capital, going into unaccountable firms, rather than keeping it in the accountability space.
Thanks so much, Julian. And so sticking with that accountability issue, Nate, I suppose your fund, Engine Number One, played a role there in terms of accountability when it came to Exxon. So how far do you think, as it stands, companies like yours are empowered to have that impact, to be able to hold big companies accountable? Or how far do you think actually there need to be certain changes in the framework, in the environment within which you operate, that would really enable you to play that role more effectively?
You know, it's a great, I like that you use the word empowerment, because that's a great opportunity to talk a little bit about our investment thesis at Engine Number One, which I was captivated by and was part of the reason I decided to join the organization. What we have at Engine Number One, well, top level, right? What we do is we tie ESG data directly to economic outcomes. And we believe that this leads to actual performance for our investors. And our concept is captured under what's called the Total Value Framework, the TVF. And it's the foundation of what we do. It's an effort to understand risks and opportunities for individual companies with a unique understanding of materiality to take those insights and use them to drive performance. So we think we're at the tip of the spear on moving ESG from ideology to economics. We call it common sense capitalism, and we align directly with the concept of stakeholder capitalism. So at our organization, we believe it is imperative that the companies with which we partner and with which we collaborate and with which we invest consider the environment, the customers, the community, and their workers when they're making investment decisions. We think good CEOs and boards care about long-term value, and they are increasingly caring about impacts, but not all of them see the connection. And what we try to do with this total value framework is make that clear. We show how ESG data is as core to the investment process as financially driven analysis. And so by connecting companies' material impacts to their financial performance over time, our framework puts a tangible value on the focused actions a company takes today. And we also show how those actions will make a company more valuable over time. Conversely, it shows how not acting will make the company less valuable over time. And that's where you really have some table stakes activities in certain instances where you need to get a company to converge or transition, otherwise face existential issues.
Thank you so much, Nate. And I should mention at this point, as Sarah's just dropped into the chat, audience members are very welcome to drop in questions of their own. I don't want to monopolize the grilling of our panelists here. So any thoughts or questions, please do drop them into the chat and I'll try and deal with as many as we can. But thank you, Nate. So some really important points there about how investors such as your firm are now approaching this and are really looking to develop value through focusing on some of these other sorts of metrics. Alberto, in terms of the point that you mentioned about how companies are using this this political force that they have you seen any impact on that front and more broadly in terms of investor pressure, in terms of getting companies on that more ethical, constructive route? Or do you think that we risk overestimating what investors can achieve? Because there is an argument, as you know, there are some who say that we shouldn't stress too much the role of investors, even the particularly impactful ones like Engine Number One, because the real change is going to happen through regulation. Where do you come down in this debate? Because it's a tricky one, and the correct answers are not totally obvious.
Yes, it's a great question. I think it's an empirical question, and we probably don't have enough information in order to be able to address it. What I perceive and what the literature has been somehow testifying is the fact that overall investors are relying more and more on ESG scores, third-party ESG entities that are asking more and more questions to companies regarding the exercise of their corporate political activity. So if you look at BGO Iris, for instance, which was recently acquired by Moody's, it's probably the most advanced survey related to political activities. And through a few semi-structured interviews we've been running in the past few months, we realized that the actual driver for this, let's say, expansion of the original ESG scores towards political activities are very much driven by investors' demand, or at least by some investors who are actually asking those questions, by realizing that there is some materiality there, but there might even be a double materiality risk there. So there is this realization from the investor side that trying to realize what a company is lobbying for might actually have an important impact, both for their investment, but also for the other stakeholders. When you talk to B corporations, so possibly the most progressive or self-proclaimed progressive companies today, they are not really much concerned about corporate political activity. So today you can be a B Corp, certified B Corp, without disclosing any of your corporate political activity, which is a bit counterintuitive. So as you can see, it's a very fragmented space out there with a lot of trends and counter trends. And I don't think we have a clear-cut pictures on how important the investor drives will be in actually making companies more accountable for their political activities. But I feel there's a willingness even to pay among consumers, among employees. They want to know more about the consistent political behavior of their employer, of their manufacturers or provider of services. This is certainly a new trend, 2022 trend, that we're going to see this developing for in my view at least.
Gillian, and thank you so much, Alberto. So some really good points there, and I think it's definitely true that the ESG ratings field at the moment is really, well, you can call it Wild West, you can call it whatever you like, but clearly it's far from the finished product, and it's as you say, if companies' political activities are not even included there, it's one very strong representation of how far there is to go on that front. Gillian, coming to you, and just to expand on Alberto's points there. There are regulatory pressures on companies. There are pressures from investors. How far do you think that's actually changing corporate behavior? How far do you think that's actually really shifted the needle in terms of how companies operate?
Thanks for that question, Simon. And before I answer it directly, I actually wanted to pick up on two things that Alberto and Professor Julia said, because I think that's important to the answer that I will give. One is that Professor Julia used the word force. She said regulatory rules, as they shift, will force particular kinds of shifts. And Alberto also spoke about the use of data, as did Nate. And I wanted to just reflect that all of my panelists are therefore speaking about the ways in which regulatory changes take place in only particular types of environments. Ones in which there are intermediaries and actors like engine number one, where there are data intermediaries and where there is an acceptance that the role of regulation is to force corporate behavior. So your question, Simon, also presumes that we are assuming that the change will come when sophisticated investors and regulators in combination force behavior from corporates. That is a very sort of common set of assumptions, but it does not leave the possibility for corporate behavior on its own, not as a result of investors forcing. And so in asking the question or in answering the question, I think that we need more inductive techniques where we actually need to be looking more at where corporate behavior and corporate strategies are actually changing, in addition to focusing on what investors are doing to change corporate behavior and what regulatory rules are doing to change corporate behavior. Because I think that why that is so important is that it allows us to place a focus on outliers and it allows us to place a focus on technology and innovation that may come also from surprising places. So my answer to where are these changes happening and where are we seeing impact is a simple one. We have to look for it, because I think that some of the discussion in this field is losing sight of some of where the solutions are actually going to be, the most important solutions are going to come from. And I'll say a little bit more about that when we wrap up.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Juliet, what do you make of that? I mean, in terms of the way that regulation is evolving, do you think in some cases there are whole angles that are particularly being missed out, or particular approaches? Gillian mentioned some possible angles there. Do you think there are just some really powerful tricks that are being missed here by the people crafting the regulations globally?
Brilliant, thanks, Simon. So first of all, I have no issue at all with what Gillian said in terms of firms themselves changing their own behaviour. So I said that regulation can force, but I also said facilitate those firms to change their behaviour in the way that they may be seeking to. Because in order to do that, they need data. Well, as we know, information is what's known in the parlance as a public good. And so it may be that in order to release that information, some people may be required to do so. So regulation is a complicated combination, as it were, of pushes and pulls, of dynamics and of iteration. Okay, it's complex, it's adaptive, it's constantly changing, and it's constantly emerging. So I think one of the things that is interesting in the regulatory space is that, I mean, you mentioned the plethora of ESG standards. We have what I've called in another context a kind of competition for regulatory share. So we have a plethora of standard setters, over 600 at the last count, some in individual sectors, some are hoping to be more global, and each are kind of positioning themselves to be, well, my standard is the best. Now that's okay up until a point, right? But the point what is the point then? Well, the point is, if you are, and I am only looking at it from the investment perspective for the purposes of this panel, right? Okay, because time's short, and you've got to focus somewhere. But if you are looking at it from the purpose of investment and you're saying, okay, building on that kind of thesis that I said before, that if where I put my money is going to influence this firm to change its behavior in this case, in a pro-climate way, then I need to be able to compare firm A to firm B, right? But if they're all complying with different standards and they're all disclosing different data, then actually I can't compare firm A with firm B. Now, this is exactly the same issue that we have in accounting standards, right? So that's why we have to move to the global accounting standards that we've got, and we've still got the split between the US and the international ISAB ones. But I think what's really interesting always in this space is that technical details, okay, we can look at that dynamic and that's quite interesting, but the technical details encode different values. And I think one of the really interesting things that's coming out, right, is we talked about materiality. Well, if you look at the standards which are kind of now emerging at global level, the International Sustainable Standards Board, kind of offshoot of IFRS, that is encoding one standard of materiality, which is that direct materiality on the firm's financial position. So it's following that entire logic of accounting standards, right? But this time it's just saying, well, you need to think more broadly about what's going to affect the value of your enterprise by thinking about climate or ESG more widely. Okay, whereas on the EU side is deliberately encoding, explicitly encoding a double materiality standard, which is you need to think about this stuff not only for the purposes of your own financial health, but because it's a good thing to do in its own right. Okay, because of those wider social environmental impacts. So I think what's really interesting in this kind of competition for regulatory share is, yeah, there's a technical issue of commensurability, okay, and the information that comes out, but there's also an encoding of different values. And my final point on this is that there's an encoding and a privileging of certain actors. So if you look at the international sustainability standards which are emerging, this is a compendium of standards. I started to count how many other different organizations' standards were actually being incorporated into the internationals, the ISSB's standards in their technical protocols. I nearly got to 100 and I kind of just gave up actually because life's too short and the panel was impending. But what's really interesting there is you have some standards being encoded are from things like the Forest Stewardship Commission, which is a transnational body, been around for a long time. Others are actually being encoded are a US trade association, or which are being encoded are a US classification system. Now, sometimes it's done in a very inclusive way, but sometimes it's done in a very direct way. You must use this US classification system. So I think we have to look quite carefully at the values that get encoded, but also whose position gets privileged in the development of these international standards. Because if they really are to be global, then we need to have a much more inclusive approach, even if that comes perhaps at the cost of commensurability and harmonization. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julia. Nate, what do you make of this? I mean, we've been talking a lot about disclosures, data, standards. Do you think that this is fundamentally something that needs to be a top focus for regulators when it comes to the way that your firm operates, the kind of data that you have access to? Is there really enough available for you to develop the kind of strategies that you'd like? Because of course this has been a big focus, especially in Europe, as we know, with various regulatory initiatives from European regulators trying to force companies to disclose more detailed data on their impact. And then of course, as Julia mentioned, the ISSB is trying to impose standards that can be deployed globally. How helpful do you think this will be to the broader picture, to the broader just transition, and how helpful will it be to investment companies like yours?
Great question, Simon. Look, I think it'll be fundamental. Back to the earlier head nod I gave to transparency as being fundamental in order for many asset managers to be able to effectively manage their investment strategies. I think that the more transparency you get through rulemaking from our regulators, the better off everybody is. So the SEC's proposal forthcoming on climate will, we expect, give more transparency to investors, more transparency to shareholders, more accountability for issuers as it relates to providing information, data that can be leveraged to make smart investment decisions, data that'll allow you to engage as active owners, which again is part of our strategy at engine number one. And so I'll admit that, you know, different companies have different strategies, and there are a lot of ways to tackle, you know, incorporating ESG into your investment theses, right? And again, ours is one of active ownership. Ours is one of take a seat at the table. There are others that want to have exclusionary screens and divest. We don't follow that thesis. However, we think across the board, no matter how, if you're trying to make smart decisions, the more data you have, the better positioned you'll be. So, you know, and that said, I mean, I understand Julia's point, and I agree. There's overcrowding, right, that can happen with so many different metrics. And so I guess I'd qualify my statement to say we need good data, right, helpful data, and we need partners in the industry that can help us interpret appropriately the data to come to reliable conclusions. But at the outset, you can't even go down that path if you can't get access to some of the information. And again, that's why we're pleased to see, digest, and engage when the SEC comes out with its reform as it relates to climate disclosures as well as human capital management. We think that's the right place to go. And obviously, all of us as impact investment attorneys and academics and students in this area, we know as a result thereof, right, we'll evaluate disclosures. Everybody that participates needs to have clear and prominent disclosures, and we'll have market materials and regulatory filings that need to be current, updated, and accurate. We'll have to modify our policies and procedures regarding due diligence and selecting investments, and our compliance protocol needs to be strong, cogent, and robust. But that's part of achieving the more laudable goal of evolving, continuing to evolve in a way where there's more transparency.
Thanks so much, Nathan. Gillian, I think you indicated you'd like to add something there.
Yes, it's actually to echo and to pick up the point that Professor Julia made about privileging certain actors. I think it's also that we have an understanding of the way in which regulation and global standard setting works that also privileges certain kinds of data. I couldn't agree with her more that the standards encode certain values. And it was interesting to hear Nate speak about common sense capitalism and stakeholder capitalism, because it means that in this conversation and in the conversation as it currently exists, there isn't even an inquiry into whether capitalism itself is the best economic system for bringing about climate justice. And so the encoding is actually quite deep because it encodes particular kinds of values, even about the economic system. And where that begins to matter is that if you have 600 regulatory standards that exist in advanced wealthy countries, there is a very real tendency and threat to impose those standards once developed as best practice in the rest of the world, without countries in the rest of the world having been a part of the regulatory standard development, and in particular, the values that underpin the regulations that are now being imposed. So if we are to have a total values approach to investment, and particularly investment in sustainable solutions, are we interested at all in exploring the kinds of values and cognitive mental models of societies and cosmologies that were actually much better than industrial capitalism in stewarding the planet? Is there room for that? Or is it too late? Because have the 600 standard setters already gone so far down the road that any discussion about opening this up at a cognitive level, at a mental models level, to interrogate the values that are encoded will be viewed as being impractical, not feasible? We've already gone down that road. So I am asking for GAIL and other platforms to recognize that what Professor Julia has said is absolutely important. It is important that we avoid the kind of privileging and the encoding that does not allow us to then be truly global by including other kinds of mental models and cosmologies.
Thank you very much, Gillian. It's a really important point there, because I think, when we talk about values-based investment, values-based business, the question is whose values, right? I mean, we sometimes talk as though these things are obvious. We talk about the positive impact. We talk about that notion as though that definition is obvious. It's obvious what a positive impact is. But there will be subtly, or even not so subtly, different perspectives from different people, different entities, different nations in the world. Alberto, you've looked a lot at how companies have a privileged position when it comes to shaping law and regulation, which they sometimes use, I think you found, in ways that are not in line with the wider interest. What is the answer, not only for addressing that excessive power of certain companies, but also for bringing more different stakeholders into the process, for helping, for example, when it comes to global standards, which can be the base for national level regulation, how those are influenced? We have various different bodies, several of which we've talked about here, and all of them, to my knowledge, most of the people drawing them up are from the rich world. Most of the people on the planet are from the developing world. So is there an answer to this, do you think, when it comes to global standards, how we can really make the influences upon the crafting of those standards representative of all the different people that they will affect?
Well, there's no doubt that lobbying today, meant as an attempt at influencing decision-making, is potentially the most powerful way to trigger system change. You are somehow redefining the rules of the game. But unfortunately, this activity is used by very few actors. So this is a bit of the lobbying paradox. So the tool that should enable us to progress the most is the tool that in reality is stopping progress today. And there's a lot of studies suggesting that the reason why we don't manage to make a major progress around issues ranging from climate action all the way to fair taxation and social justice are due to the fact that decision-making remains an activity which is predominantly influenced by very few actors, and therefore gives rise to what you refer to undue influence. This does not necessarily mean that certain interests are overrepresented over others, but certainly means that decision-making, and in particular decision makers, are prevented from the ability to listen, take into account other perspectives, other value systems that are just not under the radar of the decision makers. Hence the claim that I've been making over time that there should be a proactive duty on the corporate sector in order to maintain its own license to operate when it comes to exercising corporate political power, to make sure that everybody is seated around the table. That basically means that companies should impose on themselves not to exercise such an overdue influence unless they make sure that their opponents, other interests, other values are there. And that basically means to engage into a variety of activities. They range from civic time off, which is a practice quite common in Silicon Valley, allowing employees to engage not only in electoral activities, but also in supporting NGOs, civil society organizations, but also go beyond that in coming up with ideas which might resonate with our audience today. I call it lobbying aid. In the same way you have legal aid, when you cannot afford a legal service, well, you have the possibility to getting some lobbying aid. So the possibility of getting some professional support in order to get access to decision makers. This area of proactive support to all voices is an area which I think will be expanding in the future.
Thanks so much. There's a question from the audience here, which I'd like to throw to Julia. But I'd also really encourage other panelists to chip in. In fact, I think we should all discuss this because it's quite fundamental to what we're talking about here, which is about the need to redefine the whole concept of a company, the corporate company, and the question of whether perhaps in terms of law, that's what's needed, because of course, famously, there are certain legal responsibilities that directors and managers of companies have to do with promoting shareholder value. And the question of whether that's something that needs to be reimagined, and if it is to be reimagined, is that something that has to be done through legal and regulatory changes, or can it just be part of some sort of cultural shift? What's your take on that, Julia?
Oh, Simon, thank you. So this is a really fundamental question. I think this is one of the really interesting places where law can be an enabler, and it can be interpreted as an enabler. It can be interpreted as an inhibitor. And in the corporate space at the moment, the big debate is around the fiduciary duties, or in terms of investment, the logic of the prudent person, and coming down for corporates fundamentally to what should be their corporate purpose. We've put the British Academy, which I'm involved in, with Professor Colin Mayer, put out a very strong argument, which has been picked up by many others and is aligned with many others, that the purpose of a corporation should be there to address the needs and the problems of people on the planet, and not profit from creating problems for people on the planet. Now, the issue then does get quite legal, but that's okay, because this is an audience of lawyers, so we're allowed to get legal and techie, around whether fiduciary duties, which are the duties that directors are under and trustees are under, actually enable that, as I say, or inhibit that. So one argument is a very tight one, which is that the role of directors there to maximise shareholder value. Why is that? Partly because it's encoded in the capitalist system, but also the argument comes out because if you don't control them in some way, then they'll go off on a frolic of their own. And the only thing we can measure is shareholder value. Okay, so everything else is lovely idea, might give a nod to it. And you have this argument we've been off back 40 years, by the way, 40, 50, 60 years. Might give a nod to it, terrible shame, can't measure it. Now, so where the debate is now shifting is in two ways. One is on the fundamental, whether that's a right thing or not. And the second is to do away with the argument where you can't measure those wider impacts on stakeholders. To argue, and this is where the data is really important, this is where the standards are really important, the enabling environment that they provide is really important, to argue that actually fiduciary duties don't only inhibit directors or trustees of investment of others' funds from they don't only inhibit them from thinking only about shareholder value, but they require them to think beyond shareholder value, and they require them to think much more broadly. Again, two ways that this could be done. The first is that by taking on that kind of materiality straight off and saying, listen, you're still thinking about the value of your company or the value of your investments, you've just lengthened your time horizons and you've broadened your perspective, okay? But you've still got that essence of financial value of your company at heart. So that's kind of okay, because we can run with the narrative, we can run with that capitalist narrative, as it were. The second would be a more challenging, to Julian's point, it's much more challenging to kind of fundamental assumptions, which is that even if it doesn't impact on the value of your company, you still need to do this to maintain, as Alberto was saying, your social license. So there are two arguments there that kind of run under both fiduciary duties or for investors, the prudent person. One is running with the grain, which is a kind of financial value and protecting value of assets, but changing horizons and changing ambit. And the second is challenging that narrative. Now, the great thing is, in a way, that we might be able to achieve the latter while it's ostensibly pursuing the former, right? So you can kind of go in with a kind of sleight of hand and change it from within. But that's really where the legal debate lies.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point there, and I wonder what you make of this, Nate, in the sense of whether this really requires us to reimagine the concept of what companies are for. Because as Julia said, I mean, this is not a new debate, and for a very long time, you can go back and look at companies like Cadbury's, for example, in the UK, that over 100 years ago were talking about effectively stakeholder capitalism. So do you think we're overstating it when we talk about reimagining the company, or do you think that's actually the scale of what is called for at this point?
So I don't think it's overstated, but I think it's not necessary to achieve the goal. I think you can still achieve the goal and seize the concept of stakeholder capitalism and take the position that it is not in conflict to the fiduciary duties that members of the board have. And quite frankly, that's the thesis again. I take you back to the total value framework. We believe that using ESG criteria can lead to better outcomes over the long term for companies. And that's the role of the directors, is to maximize shareholder value. And although the industry is replete with the concept of short-termism, that's not a fiduciary duty. To look at short-term value is to maximize shareholder value, and you can maximize that over the long term by considering the positive externalities and the negative externalities. And we believe when you do that properly, you take into consideration all these the context, the environment, you think about capital formation, short, mid, and long term, you will realize as an issuer that to maximize shareholder value, you need to make the immediate investments to prepare for the energy transformation, to think through properly human capital management. I see the benefit of turning the system upside down and how it could help. But I would challenge the need to do that in order to be successful.
Yeah, it's an important point. There is still a lot that can be done within the existing paradigm. And I think there's a danger perhaps when we talk about certain enormous things that should happen, that we risk understating what can be done right now. It can almost be used as an excuse. But Gillian, what's your, and I'll give Alberto a chance to chime in on this question as well before we ring off, because it's quite a fundamental one. What's your take on this, Gillian? Do we need to fundamentally reimagine what a company is?
So I really want to thank Marlene for asking this question, and I'm going to answer it in this way. I'm assuming that the question is asked because the view is that unless we change the sort of definitions of what a company is for, that we won't arrive at our end goal, which is improvements in society. And I think that the way that I would answer it is that that actually encodes values already, because it assumes, because of Western European modernism, that the legal entity, a corporation, as separate from, with a separate legal form and legal personality, is central. And that it is, it's central to capitalism. And so I would say that perhaps there will be lawyers in GAIL who are interested in understanding what other actors within our society do we need to be focused on in order to achieve our societal objectives. For example, should we be thinking about communities? Should we be thinking about civil society, in addition to those lawyers who want to embark on a very comprehensive way to reimagine corporate forms? Because I think that each of those is important. And depending on where you're located, what your value system is, you would see either of those as the thing that you want to sort of lead your, devote your professional career to. So I'm hoping that there are some lawyers within GAIL in many countries around the world that will actually be interested in understanding how do we empower, activate communities, and maybe even civic responsibility, in addition to those lawyers who would be interested in reimagining corporations and corporate forms.
Thank you very much, Gillian. We're very nearly out of time, but before we ring off, I do want to give Alberto a chance to chip in on this question, and in particular because your work has looked a lot at times when there's tension between what's good for a company and what's good for wider society, I think. So is that inevitable with the current setup that we have? And to align the interests of companies with the interests of wider society, is a fundamental legal and regulatory change needed there?
Well, Simon, I don't think this reimagination of capitalism will be a prerogative of the legal system. So despite being a law professor, I don't think the law per se and new rules of corporate governance would be sufficient to make such a shift to occur. Certainly, as Julia said, this is key and crucial, and the legal system can actually act as a catalyst, might provide the right incentives, might actually make this ecosystem occur and perhaps happen in a more cohesive way. But at the same time, I'm very sensitive to the demand I feel from the bottom up, the social norm formation that is actually already occurring across communities. I wish we had many more B Corps, meaning alternative legal strategies available across the world that are experimented today in order to see which are the right models that could potentially be promoted. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of creativity around there. We really see these kind of black and white models. Either you're with the mainstream or you're trying to jump on something alternative, but we have very little happening in between, and I wish we could see much more. And the EU, as a jurisdiction, really wanted to make this experimentation happen. The EU has always been a sort of a laboratory of federalism in that sense, trying to see different standards competing against one another and trying to see which one could be the one. And I think this, from this perspective, this proposal for a new sustainable corporate governance framework is a bit of a missed opportunity, because we are not going to see necessarily this happening. We're going to see this kind of liability regime that will occur from one country to another. So we will see there some experimentation, but we won't see the big idea, which was originally contained in the proposal before the public consultation, where the EU basically said, we're going to come up this kind of new model for directors' duties, because this was the ambition, but this didn't materialize yet. As you know, this is not the end of the story, just a proposal. We'll have to go through the European Parliament and the Council in the couple of next 2 months, actually next 2 years, and we will see a lot of lobbying happening. We will see a lot of positioning, a lot of trade association splitting over this issue. So I think a call for experimentation is needed in this particular time, and that's where our community, our legal community, still has a lot to say and to do, with probably more creativity than in the past.
Thank you very much, Alberto. And on that note, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up. We are out of time. I think Gillian wanted to add something there, but unfortunately, we're over time, and so perhaps Gillian, you and I can discuss more later. There's always lots to talk about. But thank you so much to all the panelists. I think we've really covered a lot of ground there. I mean, the key takeaways for me are, for one thing, Gillian's really important point about representation, the question of who shapes the regulations that we see coming into form. Alberto made some really interesting points about how we can see companies potentially influencing those regulations in ways that might be excessive, and some ideas for how to tackle that. Julia made some great points about the need for clarity on how we gauge these impacts, and of course Nate had some great practical insights from his role at engine number one on how these things really work in practice. So some really excellent points all round, and I think that was a great panel discussion to kick off this very interesting initiative. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Luke, and thank you again to all the panelists, and thank you for everyone who tuned in to watch.